New Year's Eve, 2022, was supposed to be the perfect getaway. My friends and I had planned a ski trip to a remote resort in Montana, far from the crowds and chaos of the holiday season. The Snow Peak Lodge was famous for its untouched trails and rustic charm, but it was also notorious for its isolation. Nestled high in the mountains, it was accessible only by a single winding road that became treacherous in winter storms. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the jagged peaks. The resort was smaller than I'd expected, with only a handful of other cars in the parking lot. The lodge itself was cozy, its wooden beams and roaring fireplace straight out of a postcard. But the staff seemed on edge, their smiles forced, their eyes darting toward the windows as if expecting something. By the end of the night, I would understand why. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Mia, and her cousin, Sophie. We'd booked 2 adjoining rooms, planning to spend the weekend skiing, relaxing, and celebrating the new year. The first evening passed uneventfully. We ate dinner in the lodge's small dining room, played cards by the fire, and went to bed early, eager to hit the slopes the next morning. The storm started around midnight. I woke to the sound of the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. Snow lashed against the glass, and for a moment, I thought I heard something else, a faint, metallic creak, like the sound of a chairlift swaying in the wind. The next morning, the storm had eased, leaving a fresh layer of powder on the slopes. The staff warned us to stick to the marked trails, as the storm had made the backcountry routes dangerous. But Jake, ever the thrill-seeker, was already eyeing the old lift at the far end of the resort. "Come on," he said, pointing to it on the map. "The Black Ridge trails are supposed to be amazing." Mia frowned. "Isn't that lift shut down?" "It's technically closed," Jake admitted, "but I read online that it still works. We can ride it up and have the whole ridge to ourselves." Sophie and I exchanged uneasy glances, but Jake was already heading toward the lift. The Black Ridge lift was ancient, its rusted towers barely visible through the trees. A faded sign at the entrance warned against using it, but the gate was unlocked, and the lift chairs swayed gently in the wind. "This is a bad idea," Sophie said, her voice barely audible over the gusts of wind. Jake grinned. "Bad ideas make the best stories." Reluctantly, we followed him onto the lift. The chairs creaked and groaned as they carried us up the mountain, the forest below disappearing into a sea of white. The ride was slow, and the higher we climbed, the more the air seemed to change. It grew colder, heavier, as if the mountain itself was pressing down on us. About halfway up, the lift stopped. At first, we thought it was just a mechanical issue. Jake joked about it, trying to lighten the mood, but the minutes stretched into an hour, and the cold began to seep into our bones. We tried shouting for help, but the wind carried our voices away. Then, we heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound, coming from somewhere below us. At first, I thought it was the wind knocking branches against the towers, but it was too steady, too deliberate. "Did you hear that?" Sophie whispered, her breath fogging in the frigid air. Jake nodded, his grin fading. "Probably just, I don't know. Something mechanical." The tapping grew louder, more distinct, echoing through the empty forest. It wasn't random, it was a pattern, like someone tapping out a message. We peered over the edge of the chair, scanning the snowy ground below. At first, I saw nothing, just the shadows of the trees stretching across the white expanse. But then, something moved. A figure was standing at the base of one of the towers, its form blurred by the falling snow. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by a hood or a shadow. It didn't move, didn't look up. It just stood there, tapping something against the metal tower. "Hey!" Jake shouted, waving his arms. "Can you help us?" The figure didn't respond. It stopped tapping and stepped back into the shadows, disappearing from view. By now, the sun was beginning to set, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Panic set in as we realized how isolated we were. Our phones had no signal, and the lodge was too far away to reach on foot. We were stuck. And then, the lift started moving again. Relief washed over us as the chairs creaked back to life, carrying us toward the top of the ridge. But something was wrong. The lift wasn't heading for the summit, it was taking us farther, beyond the marked trails, into a part of the mountain that wasn't on the map. The trees grew denser, their branches heavy with snow, and the light began to fade. The tapping sound returned, fainter now but constant, as if it was following us. When the lift finally stopped, we found ourselves at a small clearing, the ruins of an old ski lodge barely visible through the trees. The building was dark and crumbling, its windows shattered, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. "We need to get back," Mia said, her voice trembling. "This isn't right." But the lift wasn't moving anymore, and the trail back to the resort was unmarked and treacherous. With no other choice, we decided to take shelter in the abandoned lodge. The inside was worse than the outside. The air was damp and musty, and the floorboards creaked under our boots. Old furniture was scattered around, covered in dust and cobwebs. A broken clock on the wall read 11:45. "We'll wait until morning," Jake said, trying to sound confident. "Once it's light, we can find our way back." We built a small fire in the lodge's crumbling fireplace and huddled around it, our nerves fraying with every passing minute. The wind howled outside, but it wasn't enough to mask the sounds, the tapping, the faint crunch of footsteps in the snow, the occasional creak of the lift. At midnight, the fire sputtered out. The room plunged into darkness, and the noises outside grew louder. The footsteps were closer now, circling the lodge, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. And then, we saw them. Figures appeared in the windows, their forms shadowy and indistinct. They pressed against the glass, their faces pale and blurred, their eyes hollow. One by one, they disappeared, only to reappear at another window, closer each time. "We have to leave," Sophie whispered, tears streaming down her face. Jake grabbed a broken chair leg, wielding it like a weapon. "Stay together," he said, his voice shaking. "We'll make a run for it." We burst out of the lodge and into the freezing night, the snow blinding us as we stumbled toward the trees. The figures followed, moving faster than should have been possible. Their whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I don't remember how long we ran. All I know is that, somehow, we found our way back to the resort, collapsing in the safety of the lodge's warm lobby. The staff didn't believe us. They said the old lift had been decommissioned years ago, that no one went to the ridge anymore. But the next morning, when we returned to retrieve our gear, the lift was gone. There was no clearing, no abandoned lodge, just untouched snow and an endless stretch of forest. We left that day and never went back. But every New Year's Eve, I hear the faint tapping sound in my dreams, and I see those shadowy figures at the edge of the woods. And I wonder if they're still waiting for someone to ride the lift. It was New Year's Eve, 2021, and I was spending it at a ski resort in Vermont with my older brother, Mike, and his girlfriend, Sarah. It was meant to be a fun, relaxing weekend, one last adventure before we all returned to our normal routines in the new year. The resort was small but charming, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering mountains and dense woods. The first day had been perfect, crisp air, fresh snow, and clear blue skies. But by the second day, the weather took a turn. Heavy clouds rolled in, and a biting wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it the promise of a storm. We should have stayed on the main slopes, but Mike wanted to explore. That decision still haunts me. It was mid-afternoon when Mike suggested we try the trails on the other side of the mountain. "They're supposed to be less crowded," he said, studying the map. "And there's a frozen lake over there, might be cool to check out." Sarah hesitated. "I don't know. The weather's getting worse, and those trails look pretty isolated." "Come on," Mike said, grinning. "It'll be fun. We'll just do a quick run and head back before dark." Against my better judgment, I agreed. The lift to the far side of the mountain was eerily quiet, the usual chatter of skiers replaced by the low moan of the wind. As we rode higher, the storm clouds thickened, casting the landscape in a muted gray light. Below us, the trails were narrow and winding, bordered by dense stands of trees. When we reached the top, the view was breathtaking. The frozen lake stretched out below us, a vast expanse of white framed by the dark forest. But as beautiful as it was, something about it felt wrong. The surface of the lake looked too smooth, too pristine, as if it hadn't been touched by snow or wind. And the woods around it seemed unnaturally still, the trees standing like silent sentinels. "Let's go," Mike called, already starting down the trail. Sarah and I followed, the snow crunching beneath our skis. The trail was steep and narrow, with sharp turns that forced us to stay focused. But as we descended, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Halfway down, Sarah stopped suddenly, her face pale. "Did you see that?" she asked, pointing toward the edge of the woods. "See what?" Mike asked, glancing in the direction she was pointing. "There was someone standing there," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw them move between the trees." Mike laughed. "Probably just another skier." "There's no one else on this trail," she said, her eyes wide. We stood there for a moment, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Reluctantly, we continued down the trail, the uneasy feeling growing with every turn. By the time we reached the lake, the wind had picked up, howling across the ice and rattling the branches overhead. The lake was even more unsettling up close. The ice was flawless, a perfect sheet of white that stretched as far as the eye could see. No cracks, no snowdrifts, just an unbroken expanse that seemed almost unnatural. Mike, of course, was fascinated. "This is awesome," he said, stepping off the trail and onto the ice. "Come on, let's check it out." Sarah and I hesitated. The ice didn't look safe, and the storm was getting worse. "Mike, I don't think we should," I started, but he was already halfway to the center of the lake. "Don't be such a wimp," he called, his voice carrying on the wind. "It's fine. The ice is solid." Reluctantly, I followed, with Sarah close behind. The ice creaked faintly beneath our skis, but it held. The surface was unnervingly smooth, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. When we reached the center of the lake, the wind seemed to die down, replaced by an eerie silence. The woods on the far side of the lake looked impossibly far away, and the light was fading fast. Then, we heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound, coming from beneath the ice. We froze, glancing at each other in confusion. "What was that?" Sarah whispered. "Probably just the ice shifting," Mike said, though he didn't sound convinced. The tapping grew louder, more distinct, echoing beneath our feet. It wasn't random, it had a rhythm, almost like knocking. "Let's get off the ice," I said, my voice shaking. We turned to head back to the trail, but before we could move, the knocking stopped, and the ice began to crack. At first, it was just a thin, spiderweb-like fracture beneath Mike's skis. But the cracks spread quickly, radiating outward in jagged lines. The wind picked up again, carrying with it a faint sound that made my blood run cold: laughter. It was distant and distorted, but unmistakable. High-pitched and eerie, it echoed across the lake, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Run!" Mike shouted, his voice breaking through my panic. We skied as fast as we could, the ice groaning and creaking beneath us. The laughter grew louder, accompanied by a faint whispering sound that seemed to come from the woods. When we finally reached the shore, I glanced back and froze. Figures were standing on the ice, barely visible through the swirling snow. They were tall and thin, their forms indistinct, as if they were part of the storm itself. They didn't move, didn't follow. They just stood there, watching us. "Go!" Sarah screamed, pulling me toward the trail. We didn't stop until we reached the main slopes, the lights of the lodge glowing faintly in the distance. The figures didn't follow us, but the sound of the laughter lingered, faint and distorted, carried on the wind. When we reached the lodge, we told one of the staff members what had happened. His face went pale, and he shook his head. "No one goes to that lake," he said quietly. "Not anymore. There was an accident there years ago, a group of skiers fell through the ice. They didn't make it. We left the resort the next morning, cutting our trip short. None of us has spoken about that day since, but every now and then, I dream of the lake, the figures, and the sound of the ice cracking beneath my feet. And I wake with the feeling that something is still out there, waiting." It was late January, just after the new year, when my friend Ethan convinced me to join him for a weekend of skiing in a remote part of Colorado. The ridge summit was known for its challenging slopes and breathtaking views, but not many tourists visited because of how isolated it was. That's what appealed to Ethan, and he finally talked me into going by promising to cover most of the cost. We arrived at the small lodge late Friday afternoon, just as the sun was setting. The lodge was quaint, with rustic wooden beams and a roaring fire in the lobby. The surrounding mountains were already cloaked in darkness, their jagged peaks barely visible against the sky. The plan was simple: ski all day Saturday, enjoy a quiet dinner at the lodge, and head back Sunday morning. But as the weekend unfolded, I realized I should never have agreed to come. The first day started off great. The slopes were nearly empty, the snow was powdery, and the views were every bit as stunning as Ethan had promised. We stuck to the main trails for most of the day, enjoying the well-groomed runs and the occasional friendly nod from other skiers. By mid-afternoon, Ethan got bored. "Let's try the back ridge," he said, gesturing toward a trail map pinned to a signpost. The ridge was marked as a black diamond, and the sign warned it was for advanced skiers only. "Are you sure?" I asked, eyeing the narrow, winding trail that disappeared into the trees. "It'll be fine," Ethan said, grinning. "We'll take it slow." The trail was steeper and more secluded than I expected. The trees closed in around us, their branches heavy with snow, and the silence was almost oppressive. The only sounds were the crunch of our skis and the occasional gust of wind. About halfway down the ridge, I began to feel uneasy. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, as if something was moving just out of sight. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. "Do you hear that?" Ethan asked suddenly, stopping in the middle of the trail. "Hear what?" "Voices." I listened, straining to hear over the sound of the wind. At first, there was nothing, but then I heard it, a faint murmur, like someone talking far away. It was hard to make out, but it sounded like laughter. "Maybe there are other skiers," I said, though the words felt hollow. We hadn't seen anyone else on this trail, and the lodge had been nearly empty when we left. Ethan shrugged and started skiing again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We reached the bottom of the ridge just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The trail ended at a narrow clearing, with no sign of the main slopes. Ethan pulled out the map, frowning as he traced the routes with his finger. "This should be it," he said, glancing around. "But it doesn't look right." I looked up at the ridge we had just come down, the trees casting long shadows across the snow. That's when I saw them, two figures standing near the edge of the trail, motionless and silent. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Do you see that?" He followed my gaze, his face going pale. The figures were tall and thin, their features obscured by the fading light. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, watching us. "Let's go," Ethan said, his voice tight. He grabbed his poles and started skiing toward what we hoped was the main trail. The clearing led to a narrow path that wound through the trees. The laughter we'd heard earlier grew louder, echoing around us, but there was still no one in sight. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, and I felt like the trees themselves were closing in. Then, the path ended. We skidded to a stop at the edge of a steep drop-off. Below us was a dense forest, with no sign of the lodge or the main slopes. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. "We have to go back," I said, turning to Ethan. But he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on something behind me, his face ashen. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The figures were closer now, standing at the edge of the path. There were more of them, 5, maybe 6, and they were no longer motionless. They swayed slightly, their heads tilted as if listening. Their faces were still obscured, but I could feel their eyes on us. "Run," Ethan said, his voice shaking. We scrambled back up the path, our skis awkward and unwieldy on the uneven ground. The figures didn't follow, but their presence was palpable, pressing down on us like a weight. The laughter returned, louder and more distorted, echoing through the trees. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, and I could feel it vibrating in my chest. We finally reached the ridge and started skiing as fast as we could. The trail was treacherous in the dark, and I nearly lost my balance several times. Ethan was ahead of me, his figure barely visible in the gloom. Then, the laughter stopped again. I glanced back and froze. The figures were on the trail, moving faster than should have been possible. They didn't ski, they glided, their bodies bending and twisting unnaturally. "Don't stop!" Ethan shouted, his voice breaking through my paralysis. We reached the main slopes just as the first lights of the lodge came into view. The figures didn't follow us out of the trees, but I could still feel their presence, lingering just beyond the edge of the forest. We stumbled into the lodge, breathless and trembling. The lobby was empty, the fire in the hearth burning low. We tried to tell the manager what had happened, but he just shook his head. "No one skis the ridge after dark," he said, his expression grim. "Not anymore." We left the next morning, cutting our trip short. Neither of us has been back to Ridge Summit since that night. But every now and then, I hear that laughter in my dreams, and I see those figures standing in the shadows. And I wonder if they're waiting for someone else to stray too far.